Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Well, howdy folks, and welcome to a video where we're going to take a look at another news article about wargaming that I came across about a week or so ago. Now, the last article I went over was that one about crowdfunding, and it actually got a really good response, lots of great comments, and I enjoyed making it. So when I read this article, I thought, well, why not? Let's make a video about it. Let's put it out there. I'll add in my own 2 bits, and then we'll see what everyone else thinks. Because this article, in a roundabout way, it's not just what the article's about specifically, but the article actually touches on one of the biggest questions in wargaming as a hobby and as an industry. And that's, what makes a wargame good? Now, that's a question that will certainly deserve its own video, and perhaps this video is a springboard into that larger one. So maybe I'll end up getting around one of these days to making a longer video looking at that question, what makes a game good? But for now, we're going to look at the comparison that he makes here and consider that kind of as a larger question. So the article we're going to read here comes from the website Wargamer. And of course, I got to take a bit of a stab at them right from the get-go, because I went to their homepage, and their tagline is all things tabletop wargaming, 40K, Magic the Gathering, and D&D. Yeah, the entirety of tabletop wargaming is 40K, Magic the Gathering, and Dungeons & Dragons. Now granted, those are the most popular games in their respective genres, but why not make the tagline all things tabletop gaming? Miniature games, card games, and role-playing games. Now, I already know the answer. They need to get clicks, and you don't get clicks unless you throw out the big names that are going to get people's attention. So I get that. But still, it comes across like when GW tried to refer to the Warhammer hobby and not the miniature wargaming hobby, with Warhammer the biggest fish in that particular pond. So right off the bat, that kind of rubbed me the wrong way. It's like if you don't play one of those 3 games, you're not actually wargaming. And I'm sure most of us, even those who play Warhammer 40K, Magic the Gathering, or Dungeons & Dragons, I'll bet you play other stuff that isn't one of those 3. So, all right, enough of that. Let's get on to the article itself. The article is titled, 5 Things the Halo Wargame Does Better Than Warhammer 40K by Timothy Lindward. Now, his bio is at the end of the article, and it describes him as a 40K fanatic. Now, that could be good or bad. If he's that big of a fan of 40K, and yet the article is praising another wargame for doing a better job, then that certainly gets my attention. Hearing fanboy praise means very, very little, but hearing a fanboy criticize and praise a competitor, now that's more interesting. So let's see what he's got to say here. We'll start off with this double pick here of an Ultramarine and the Master Chief. Let's get the fighting in the comments off to a great start. So, who would win, an Astartes or a Spartan? Ready, set, go. All right, anyways, while you all are fighting about that in the comments, let's move on. So, Lindward, he doesn't mince words. The opening paragraph just jumps right into it and says that he's been able to play a lot of the new Halo Flashpoint game. And he said that he's impressed by 5 things that it does better than Warhammer 40K. Now that definitely got my curiosity, and I appreciate the directness, but I also have a reservation here. Halo Flashpoint is a skirmish game. Warhammer 40K isn't. Shouldn't he be comparing Halo Flashpoint and Kill Team? Is it fair to compare a skirmish game rule set with a larger wargame rule set? Isn't like that comparing a single sports team with an entirely different league? I was even a little more confused when the next line of the article was, where 40K is a game of massive armies and hours-long battles, Halo is a tight skirmish game. Okay, so you even recognize that it's not a parallel comparison, but we're gonna do it anyways, I guess. Now what I want to know is, why didn't you compare it to Kill Team? If you're a huge fanatic of 40K, surely you're familiar with Kill Team, and surely you've played it, or at least know about it. So why didn't you do that? And I'm starting to think back to my comments earlier about the website tagline, and I think I get it. Once again, it's about the clicks. Kill Team is big, but 40K is bigger. And search engines and algorithms are going to pick up the article much more for using 40K as the point of comparison instead of Kill Team, even though that makes the comparison a bit off kilter, and that's really unfortunate. But that's what we've got. So let's continue. His first point of comparison is that you can pick up Halo and play it right out of the box. So essentially, Halo comes almost fully pre-assembled. The minis are already one piece, the terrain is simple cardboard that can be assembled in a minute or two, the minis are unpainted, but the terrain is printed. So when the game is set up, everything will be just about tabletop ready except for no paint on the minis. 40K, on the other hand, gives you sprues for the minis and terrain that you're going to have to assemble first, and then the board will still be covered with gray plastic, both models and terrain. Starter sets for Halo or 40K have minis, a board, dice, rulers, all that stuff, so in a way, they're both playable right out of the box, except for the miniatures. You're going to need a day or two to assemble your 40K minis, and you're going to need a week or two, possibly a month or two, to paint them. So for newcomers to wargaming, or even to veterans who are testing out a new gaming system, this is indeed a big advantage. I'm sure many of us know how excited someone was to buy into 40K, only to get frustrated or bored at the assembly of the models and maybe even quit right there. The excitement of holding the box in their hand at the store couldn't carry them through however long it was going to take to fiddle with the tiny pieces, the glue, sticking things together, and increasingly GW's models are getting, I think, overly complicated in their building, partly to prevent recasting, but even if that's not the case, if someone's new to the hobby, getting to spend an hour to put together 5 guys in an infantry squad, knowing that they've got another 30 to go, well, that could turn them off a little bit. When you're wanting to test or play a new game, you want to test or play a new game. You don't want to buy the game and then have to do a lot of work in order to enjoy it. And then decide if you want to start adding yet more models to your pile of shame. So it certainly is an advantage to be able to buy the game, head to your friend's house, and immediately play it that day, only needing time to read through the rules, rather than having to buy it and schedule a time to play a couple days later once you've had time to build. So this is a solid point of comparison because even if compared with Kill Team, the advantage still stands. His second point is that the rules for the battlefield are seriously smart. Now, that's a bit of a hyperbole or an exaggeration. I don't know if I'm using the right word there. It's not just smart, but seriously smart. What does that even mean? Effective, pragmatic, simple, efficient, any of those would have been a better word choice. And what exactly separates seriously smart rules from just moderately smart rules? All right, I'm getting a bit hyperbolic myself here, but you get my point. Anyways, the claim here is that Halo tosses out the tape measure. I mean, right out the window. The entire board is grid-based. While that's different, it's certainly not unique, which means it can't be all that smart. Star Wars Imperial Assault and Blood Bowl spring to mind as games that utilize a grid system instead of measuring distances with a tape measure. The one thing that Halo may be adding, I don't know, I haven't played every wargame out there, is a third dimension based on cubes rather than squares, so that vertical and horizontal distance are taken into account in movement. Jumping up or down off of walls, buildings, and cargo containers is no different than walking into an adjacent square across a horizontal flat landscape. Now, additionally, Halo uses true line of sight, and since the models aren't as flamboyant or elaborate as 40K, there's going to be less arguing about, oh, well, I can see a little bit of your rifle and the wingtip from your model, therefore you're in line of sight so I can shoot you. Now, 40K also uses true line of sight, so, okay, it's not that unique. It's not seriously smart. Now, Linward does have a better choice when he refers to the combination of true line of sight and a grid system as clean. That's simple, and it emphasizes the speed of gameplay over realism. Like with the pre-assembled box set, there is something that appeals to new gamers, or to people that want their games to be faster paced, to be light on rules and more beer and pretzels, if you know what I mean. The comparison here would also hold if compared to Kill Team, but I'm not fully ready to concede the point. He's right that Halo is simpler or cleaner than 40K, but that doesn't automatically make it better. game complexity is a player preference, and while there can be games that are too simple or too complex, there is quite a bit of gray area in between. His next point is that the game modes feel genuinely distinctive. Now, the missions in Halo Flashpoint are based on the multiplayer missions from the Halo video game. You have Capture the Flag, Slayer, Oddball, and so on. In 40K, Linward states, quote, "You just have different flavors of War of Attrition." Now, he's not entirely wrong here, though he hasn't explained why as well as he could have. In earlier editions of 40K, most missions were the same. Beat the crap out of your opponent for 4 rounds and then grab the objectives at the end of the 5th round. I remember those days well, and I didn't like them either. But the introducing of the Maelstrom of War mission cards did a lot to make the games more tactical and variable from round to round within a single game. And GW has built on that since then. What Linward fails to mention is a key element of Halo, that like in the video game, your models respawn. That removes the strategy of trying to wipe out your opponent because, well, you can't. Instead, you have to play the mission. Now, I know that's a pretty novel idea. Now, I'm a bit surprised that he didn't mention that, because without that crucial detail, there really isn't that big of a difference between a lot of the missions. For example, Oddball in Halo is very similar to the Relic in 40K, and both games have a mission where you're just supposed to kill so many of your opponent. But if your opponent can respawn, that's very, very different, whereas in 40K and in Kill Team, of course, once a model's removed, for the most part, it's pretty much removed. Now, also his claim about being distinct is a bit unfair, vague, or maybe a bit of both. Does he mean that the missions are distinct from each other, distinct from 40K missions, or distinct in that they're all from the Halo video game? Now, obviously, it can't be that the missions are distinct from each other. That's kind of essential. Are they distinct from 40K? Well, maybe a little here and there, but there are some core mission mechanics or elements that pretty much every wargame has. There's always going to be some variation of King of the Hill. There's going to be some variation of Capture the Flag. There's going to be some variation of just kill as many of your opponent's models as possible. So Halo may have a couple unique ones in the sense that they have a unique name tied to the game, but let's not get crazy here. Also, Halo benefited from the fact that it has, 2 decades of the game to build on. So you can take the missions and things from the game that people are already familiar with and simply convert those to the tabletop. Whereas Warhammer had to develop those tabletop first, and then the video games came later and borrowed that, which I thought they did actually pretty well. So, on to this question then about, are the missions distinct because they replicate the video game? I wouldn't call that distinct, I'd call that being true to your IP. So on this one, mission variety is definitely important when making a war game good, unless you're playing chess. And Halo does have something that 40K doesn't, but he didn't really explain it as well as he could. And finally, this is where comparing Halo to 40K instead of to Kill Team becomes an issue. I haven't played the newest version of Kill Team, the one that just came out a week ago, and I'm recording this at the end of October. But from what I recall of Kill Team when it was released about, 6-7 years ago, and even the more recent release 3 years ago, and then you guys will have to fill me in on the one that was just released a week or so ago, how different are the missions? Does it really feel like just kill everything for 4 turns and grab objectives in the 5th? Or does Kill Team have enough variety for it to be different? Right? Has this article actually made a point, or is it just saying that Halo is copying itself? And 40K didn't do that, which kind of seems obvious. Moving on to point number 4. Headshots feel cooler than crits. So in Halo Flashpoint, dice rolls have to meet a target number rather than having opposed rolls like in Space Weirdos or Infinity or something like that. Halo uses D8, and every time you roll an 8, it counts as a quote-unquote headshot, and you get to roll another die for free. If the new roll is also an 8, you can keep rolling. So according to the article, it's a lot more emotive than rolling a pool of dice and fishing for 6s. Okay, there's a lot to say here. Let's start with the semantics. What the mechanic is called doesn't matter. Call it a headshot, call it a crit, call it a lucky shot. It doesn't matter what you call it. call it whatever you want. The game has a mechanic where a specific number does something good. All right, well, let's compare the mechanic. Once you roll 8, you keep that dice and roll another. On an 8, you roll another. And as Linward points out, you could conceivably score 6 hits off of 3 dice. It's unlikely, but it's possible. Now, this isn't as different from 40K as he's making it sound. In 40K, you have weapons with the sustained hits rule, meaning that a critical roll is multiplied. Now, sure, that's restricted to weapons that have that rule, while the headshot mechanic is universal because it applies to the shooter, not the weapon. So you could be shooting a sniper rifle and still get your hit multiplied, so that's definitely different. But honestly, how often will you roll an 8 that many times in a row versus rolling 6s that explode in 40K? Now believe me, I played orcs in 40K, and the only thing more satisfying than rolling 20 dice in an orc shooting phase is getting 30 hits. And then on top of that, remembering that an orc has a ballistic skill of 5. This was back in 8th edition, by the way. I don't know if the orcs are still as shooty in 10th edition as they were in 8th, but the point is, the thrill he describes is in both games. It's just a little bit more likely in Halo. Fair enough. That's a reasonable thing to point out. But state that as the point. Headshots feel cooler than crits is subjective, and I'm not sure everyone would even agree. Whereas if stating the point was greater possibility for clutch hits or saves, or something like that, would have been a better way to describe this mechanic and what the advantage he sees in this mechanic over what 40K has. Also, as a side note, calling it a headshot is a bit of poor naming, since the defender gets access to the same mechanic when they try and defend, if I'm not mistaken. I've only watched a couple games played on YouTube. I haven't played the game myself, but if I recall, when the defender's rolling their defense, if they roll 8s, they get to keep going as well. So by calling it a critical makes more sense because that applies to attack or defense, while rolling a headshot on the defense seems off. And as for rolling a pool of dice and fishing for 6s, that, my friend, is one of the reasons that I enjoy tabletop wargames more than tabletop RPGs. I like throwing big handfuls of dice instead of just rolling one. It feels like a barrage of gunfire or a fury of punches when I'm rolling a huge bunch of dice. Now, I'm not saying that the Halo headshot mechanic isn't interesting, though. It's different, but I don't know if it's necessarily better. I'd also be curious, statistic-wise, if you're at most rolling, I think 5 or 6 dice is the most that you're going to roll in a single attack roll in Halo. And the 8s allow you to keep rolling, but you have to keep rolling 8s for the mechanic to keep going. Whereas in 40K, when you have something like sustained hits, you roll the 6, you get the extra hits. That's it. I wonder if, statistically speaking, you're more likely to get additional hits rolling a d6 with criticals like in 40K versus the d8 mechanic that we have in Halo. Or will it all come out to usually about so much a percentage more hits? I don't know. It just seems like he's trying to make this one sound different, when in reality, it's just a different way of applying a pretty standard mechanic. And here we are on the last one. Command dice are smoother than command points. In Halo, each player rolls a few dice, as in 1 to 4, and the rolls determine what special actions or abilities that player has available to them each turn. It could be shoot again, fight again, move again, stuff like that. Command points and stratagems are way more complicated, as I'm sure many of you are aware. If you're not aware, allow me to briefly explain and give you an example. Since Halo uses D6 for this feature, each player has 6 possible command abilities. The same 6 command abilities. Everyone shares those 6. They don't change, and you don't add more depending on what army you play. It's always 6. And on top of that, it's randomized since you're rolling a dice to determine which ones you get. 40K, on the other hand, gives each player a set number of command points, like a bank account, at the start of each game, and the players spend those points on stratagems, many of which do similar things to Halo's command dice. But here's the big difference. in 40K, there are 11 common stratagems in the main rulebook that any player can use, and then at least a half dozen more specific to each army in the Codex, giving players somewhere 15 or so to choose from, and the player has to determine when and where to spend their command points. Now that by itself makes it miles ahead of Halo in terms of complexity and possibility. Learning to use your command points is almost like investing in the stock market. To maximize the effect, you need to know which stratagem to use, when to use it, and if you can see into the future, that's super duper helpful as well. Stratagems got a little bit carried away in 8th and 9th edition, where you could end up with, I think it was over 20 stratagems, and some of them were super niche and other ones were so good they were auto-use. It just got out of control. So when 10th edition came out, Games Workshop said they were going to clean it up, and all they did was swap it. Instead of 3 common and 15 in your codex, there were now almost a dozen common and then a half dozen in the codex. In the end, you still have the same number that you're using. Now, Linward is right when he says that the command point system detract focus from the game. Honestly, we all know a time when a player, possibly you, shouted, "Hang on a second, I think I have a stratagem for this." And then we wait for 10 minutes while they look for it, figure out if it works, figure out if they have the command points, think of the possible outcomes. He does have a point. Halo removes all that. So I am absolutely in agreement with Linward that the command dice mechanic is smoother, but I won't necessarily say that it's better. I do like that command skills are both uniform and random in Halo. You get benefits, but you can't stack the deck or build your army around a specific command stratagem. I recall back in 8th or 9th edition, if you played Chaos, you brought some kind of heavy-hitting unit and you used Endless Cacophony, and you got to shoot twice. You basically got to delete 2 units every single turn. It was unbelievable. The concern I would have with the Halo command dice is if you play this game enough, they may start to feel a bit monotonous. I can't say for sure, I haven't played it, but the same 6 possibilities, all determined randomly. So I think we're going to revisit what I said in the second point, where he talks about in the article about movement based on cubes rather than measuring in inches. Yes, it's simpler, but that doesn't automatically mean it's better. Simple is not always better, and better is not always simple. There's your cliche for you. They're great for new players, simple rules that is, or they're great for players who want a more gradual learning curve, but at the other end of the spectrum, you have Checkers, one of the simplest tabletop games I can think of, but that's a little bit too simple. The reason I don't play Checkers is because I'd rather play a tabletop game that has slightly more complex rules and also the minis, obviously. So what do we have then at the end of this article? Well, let's summarize it real quick. Number 1, the game is ready to play. Yes, you cannot argue with that. The drawback to Halo being ready to play is on the hobby side of things, not on the gameplay side. Number 2, the rules for the battlefield are seriously smart. No, the rules are simpler and streamlined. That's only an advantage if you want simpler and streamlined. The emphasis in Halo seems to be fluidity, while the emphasis in 40K seems to be tactical complexity. And the new kill team might address this issue, though from what I've seen, it's more complex than the previous versions. Number 3, the game mode feels distinctive. They're distinctive in the way that they're pulled from the Halo video game. So yeah, they're going to feel tailor-made for Halo Flashpoint because they are. You're talking about a game that's had over 20 years of working and building a foundation of PvP elements and then simply porting them over to the tabletop. I'd be more surprised if the missions didn't directly mirror the video game. But while GW charges too much for their mission cards and similar accessories, I think 40K has come a long way in making the missions feel different and interesting. Number 4, headshots feel cooler than crits. The mechanic may have a different name, but at the core of the mechanic, it's the same. It's just applied universally. And if someone with more patience and knowledge than I wants to crunch those numbers to see whether 5d8 with the headshot rule versus 5d6 with the sustained fire rule, I'd be curious. Is there really going to be that much difference? Number 5, command dice are smoother than command points. 100% agree. And personally, I'd say that's not just a fact, but I'd say that's something Halo does, quote unquote, better than 40K, but I could see myself being more in favor of the command point system if it were toned down. If GW did maybe 3 or 4 common stratagems and then 3 or 4 army specific, I think it would give you a nice amount of control. It would give armies very specific, very situational flavor to use them, and it's small enough that you can learn them very quickly, kind of like what they did with their combat patrol, where they try and introduce you to a little bit of the stratagems, the emphasis being learn the rules and have more fluid gameplay rather than spending hours and hours reading books and trying to remember your rules. So the Halo mechanic is definitely smoother and it's definitely more fair because everyone shares the same ones and they're randomly chosen. For me, that's preferable to the current 40K command point mechanic, but that doesn't mean it's not superior completely to the idea of command points and stratagems. So I'd say 2 out of 5 of these I agree, 2 of them I half agree, and 1 I think is overstated. But what do you guys think? Where does he get it right and wrong? Where do I get it right and wrong? And I'll end on this. Making this video got me curious about what qualities, features, and mechanics make a tabletop game good. So let's keep an eye out for that one. Maybe I'll ask for some community input before I start drafting the script. But until then, keep your dice on the table, and I'll see you on the next one.